Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Watch No Evil. This is Matt,
And this is Zach.
and today we will be talking about the 2014 vampire western film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. For those of you who are probably unfamiliar with this, as it is a foreign film, the story follows the titular character of the girl, played by Sheila Vaughn, while she hunts down unscrupulous men in this fictional town of Bad City. This is intertwined with the story of Arash, a young Iranian man who is struggling to cope with his heroin-addicted father and his own lack of status. And it plays with the idea of the Western in the tropes of outlaw justice, vigilantism, and the stoicism of an unnamed anti-hero, which takes precedent over like the flamboyant emotive outbursts indicative of a traditional vigilante Avenger Batman-like film. It was inspired by the films of Sergio Leone, and those can be found in the way that it imitates duel sequences using the girl and her soon-to-be victim men. And the wildly diverse soundtrack, which incorporates music from Armenian musician Bayru, the Tehran band Kiosk, the band White Lies, and Dariush seamlessly blend rock, folk, jazz, and ambient electronic music to create an atmospheric yet temporally ambiguous score. This was all directed by Anna Lily Amirpour. Actually, I found out in California. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, really?
It was filmed in California.
That would explain the
And
English graffiti.
surprise, surprise, it was based on a short film.
Oh my gosh. Let's
The curse continues.
let's just rename our podcast based on a short film.
Based on a short
We're gonna
film.
become like an indie film podcast instead of a horror film podcast.
I mean, we are halfway there. This film, though, the thing about it is it definitely has the indie film vibe. I mean, especially in the fact that they're using black and white to sort of, I think, throw back to the sort of German expressionist vampire aesthetic. Vampires look so much better in black and white, but it's so well done and in a way that feels cool. And I don't mean cool by like cool. I mean cool as in like it's the opposite of warm. It's sort of isolating and it makes it really ambiguous when it comes to the actual content of the movie being isolatory but also very indifferent. So the audience gets to experience everything without the cloak of familiarity that we normally assume with horror movies.
Yeah, the black and white for a modern audience is kind of alienating in a way. And that pairs well with some other elements of the film, like the really slow sequence in the plot, and also when you're like watching an individual scene, especially when you have scenes between Arash and the girl. It's just all the motions are so slow, very purposeful, but slow. And that is like another thing where it feels like a little bit on edge and alien to, at least it did to me.
Very tense.
Yeah, and I feel like that was completely intentional. And then comparing that with this wide variety of soundtrack influences and pop culture references, I feel like the writers and the director didn't want you to feel you knew what the setting was or you knew what was going to happen next. It was just constantly trying to alienate the viewer.
I mean, obviously, the name Bad City is sort of bland and generic. It's sort of, it is akin to Sin City. When you think about the idea behind Bad City is it's supposed to sort of portray these neglected characters, and Arash specifically is the poster boy for that idea of neglect. He's sort of rebuked by his own father because his father's only purpose in life is to find his next deal of heroin, and he wants to rise in status. And I think that one of the pivotal scenes for Arash specifically is when he is at the costume party. He's dressed as Dracula, and the rich girl that he works for hears that he has drugs, and I think it's meant to represent he is trying to involve himself with that crowd of people through the provision of drug sale. he's trying to seem cool to them and sort of invade their circle. And he's still rejected. And that's, I think, why after he takes ecstasy, he sort of has like a mental meltdown at the party where he's watching her and she's going to start dancing with this other guy and she's not going to dance with him. And it's supposed to be sort of a class stratification.
So you might say he is dealing gateway drugs because the drugs are his gateway into the higher class.
Mm-hmm. And he's got the wrong set of keys.
Right.
You know?
Well, he's got ecstasy, so.
He's got ecstasy. He also has heroin. Did he try the heroin?
The way that he reacted when she was like, here, you take ecstasy now, that it made me feel like he had never done drugs before.
Oh, for sure.
He was only dealing the drugs because he saw that Saeed, I don't know if they're supposed to be friends or whatever, but the guy that his dad owes money to.
Oh, they're definitely not friends.
Yeah, I guess.
Saeed is a businessman.
Right. So I think he saw like the lifestyle that Saeed was living, and he's like, well, that's what I want. And I want the girls, and I want the money, and I want, that like swanky apartment. So he is like, well, he deals drugs, so I'm going to start doing that.
You really get to see all of the levels of, I suppose, addiction and the idea of how it affects a community, potentially, based on the very few but important character relationships in this movie, because you see his relationship with Saeed, which is entirely parasitic. Arash has to, in fact, keep providing for his father, who's addicted to these drugs, and he's ultimately the one that pays for it. And so that's why I think he's, one, hesitant to do drugs, because when you see the crippling effects that they can have, his father is, he's abusive, he is abrasive, and it's because of his addiction. And then you get to see Saeed, who is a dealer, but he is also a user, and it really portrays him as this sort of irredeemable character.
Yeah, he's not a good guy.
Yeah, he's not a good guy. And it's interesting, I was watching this and thinking, after Saeed's death, Arash starts to sell drugs in the same street corners that Saeed would have. And there's almost this idea that Arash sees the success and sort of wants to gain that success. It's like he's trying to find his own place, which is either going to be in the upper class with the girl who rejects him, or it's going to be selling drugs on the sidewalk and just being sort of the local dealer. And obviously he's not happy with that particular decision. And I think that that's why he has the reaction he does to running into the girl on that almost like suburban looking street.
Yeah, that scene was really different than the rest of the movie, at least with setting. A lot of it is very urban kind of feel, and a lot of it is kind of like this run down kind of feel, but in that moment it's like got this like cleaner suburban kind of look to it, and I don't know what the reasoning for that would have been, but it seems like everything in this movie kind of has a reason and a meaning to it.
Well, I think that part of it is because Arash, he runs into the girl and he says, I don't know this place, where are we? And she says, Bad City. And I think that was the first time that they say it in the movie, because both of you and I started having the conversation about it. Like, oh, was that a weird translation? And he initially refutes that that's where they are. And I think that to him, it really is, refuting it, because there is a clear class stratification. There's this upper class suburb area that's really nice, it's really clean, it's really idyllic. And then everything else is juxtaposed with, I guess, the slums, the graffitied buildings, the dingy alleys, the dirty chain link fences, juxtaposing those specifically with the industrial imagery of the oil rigs and the smokestacks that are coming out. It's really separating them, and Arash thinks he has found his place, and then obviously is rejected, and so he's making his way back to Bad City, and she becomes his guide.
Yeah, because then there's that last scene where they're actually like in Bad City together, is in that train yard, which is really back to that more industrial feel.
Yeah, and he brings the Frisbees made out of meat.
Translation, burgers.
I think that was a really interesting scene too. The whole presence of food as like a metaphor in that particular scene. And I know it's partially to to be like, oh, she's a vampire and she can't eat. And that's why he's bringing it. But I would like to give this film more credit and think that there is obviously more to it. It's sort of the idea of the retro 1950s sort of reference that they're going for. It's the hamburgers in a paper sack that they bring on their first date. If you think about Grease Lightning, when you ask a girl out, you say, hey, you want to go get a burger and a shake? And it's supposed to be that, timeless element to it as well.
Yeah, and so we're kind of getting into the meat of this film's kind of like metaphorical workings.
No pun intended. You said the meat of this film's metaphorical work.
I truly no pun intended. But that's seemingly basically toxic masculinity. So the whole film kind of pivots on this idea of the girl being the vampire. She is preying on men.
She is a feminist icon.
So she's preying on men. She's the one walking home alone at night, and she's actually like stalking her victims at night. And of course, the expectation when you hear the film's title is that, oh, the girl is going to be the victim. That's what you think immediately when you hear a girl walks home alone at night. And
it's dangerous.
And it's this reversal because she's a vampire. She is preying on human victims who are men. So with this reversal, it kind of gives you this idea of like, well, if the roles were reversed, then the male would be the villain. He's stalking his prey at night. So you get that kind of idea going throughout the movie. And then there are a bunch of other things that buffer that metaphor as well. For example, you've already mentioned the oil well imagery. And
right.
If you think about like what oil wells do and oil drills, they're drilling into the earth, they're penetrating the earth. That's kind of like a metaphor for...
You're right, but ew.
Well, where'd you think I was going with that?
I knew where you were going with it.
Oh, you just wanted to... Okay.
Express my grossness. That's gross.
There are a lot of sexual metaphors in this film.
Yeah, and they're mostly related to reclamation. Well, because Sahid's whole character is like the power dynamic. That's what it hinges on.
Right.
And I mean, that's sort of what the... I think the title also sort of implies, but...
And then, of course, every relationship are very meaningful as well. For example, between Sahid and the girl, he sees her on the street and they're walking in opposite directions, and then he sees her, they just kind of like look at each other and pass each other by, and then you can tell he gets this feeling of like someone's watching him and that it's her standing behind him. So then he's like immediately put into the vulnerable position. But then, of course, he kind of like tries to flip it, and he's like, "Oh, I'll come back to my place." And I guess he felt like
and he's not reading the danger.
No, not at all.
He's just like, "Oh, this girl is looking at me, and I obviously know what that means."
Even from that point in the movie, he's already been made out to be not a good person.
His whole aesthetic revolves around being a representation of that toxic masculinity, and I think about sort of the use of the jungle like furniture that's in his house, which is typically used to represent like primalcy or like obviously the masculine drive, the testosterone drive behind everything. He's got the stag heads mounted on the walls.
Oh yeah.
Right? And he does all of these proto-masculine things or masculine presenting things. Like he comes in, he doesn't even really talk to her, but he goes and he turns on like some bumpin' techno music. He does a line of cocaine, and then he starts lifting weights. And it's just like, okay, we get it, Scarface. Like, we know what you're trying to do.
And then he does 2 more lines of cocaine.
Yeah, it's like, you can certainly chill, sir. And I mean, obviously the finger sucking is very phallic representing, and the fact that she bites it off is, one, important as a symbol of what's happening, but 2, the fact that she then, after biting it off before attacking and killing him, shoves it into his own mouth. It's flipping the penetrative power dynamic that you would typically be thinking of. If you think back to the Greeks and the Romans, that was the least masculine thing you could do. In the Greek sort of tradition, there actually still was a masculine hierarchy, and so men who would perform that on other men were considered less masculine than actually women largely.
Okay, so it's a largely submissive behavior.
Yeah, it was the most submissive behavior that you could entertain. And so the idea behind it is that it really does come down to a whittling away of one's masculinity through the power complex.
Yeah, I mean it's very clear there because he's already down a finger and she's standing over him at that point and she's like kind of throwing him around a little bit. It's very clear in that moment that like she is the one in control.
Right, and I think that it flips the vampire metaphor really beautifully too, because you think about vampires in traditional media, they are always still sort of these sensual creatures, but it's often through, some sort of manipulation. And I think about Dracula being able to hypnotize people in the OG versions of the Dracula mythos, and they're always seen as being these creatures that take on that sort of power dynamic and that sexiness. And this is really the opposite, and in a couple of ways. I think about like a lot of female vampire characters, they always like to enhance their femininity. And in this case, the girl is covered every time that she engages in a vampiric activity. She's got the full cloak on. She is as covered as she can be. And it's only when she is dealing with Arash and has the cloak taken off that you see sort of the vulnerability and the more human side to her. Mm-hmm. I also think that they just gave her the cloak because it looks awesome when she like does the thing where she flips it out before pouncing on people.
Yeah, that was really cool.
It just looks so cool.
The classic vampire move when you see like the cape goes out, jumping forward onto their prey. And because this is by no means a traditional type of vampire movie. Mm-mm. And I feel like they had to have some of those classic vampire tropes. That being one of them. Of course, the fangs kind of coming out when they're ready to feed is another one, and they show like that close up. I mean, I'm sure if you're listening, you can imagine exactly what I'm describing.
And also, I think how when she asks Arash to pierce her ears, the fangs click out when she's in pain, to be like, oh, this is a reminder that even in this very human moment, that is not what she is.
That actually, it's funny that you bring the earrings up, because that's another moment is when he goes, well, it's a shame your ears aren't pierced because you can't wear them. And she goes, well, you can pierce them right now. And so she hands him a clothespin, and he heats it up and sterilizes it and pierces her ears so that she can wear these earrings. He does this, and the fangs come out. And that's a whole other kind of sexual metaphor, is that he's piercing her ear, if you can read into that, is penetrating her ear.
I actually think that it's a metaphor for consent, because he says, oh, it's a shame that your ears aren't pierced, and he's not going to force it, but instead she consents to having her ears pierced.
The fact that her ears are not pierced, I feel like that's like almost like a symbol of purity. And then him actually doing the act of piercing her ears is, I think consent can go along with it, but she has chosen him to be the one to take that purity that she has had her whole life.
I agree. I totally think that that's what's going on.
Then she puts the earring in right away after he pierces it, and there's like this really awkward moment where she's like rushing to get it in. There's the whole idea that vampires don't bleed themselves because they don't have blood.
And they heal incredibly fast.
Right. So I think that that's kind of a nod to that. Is like she didn't want to see that she didn't bleed even though she just basically got stabbed, or that it closed up immediately.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. Even though they drive away into the sunset in his like 19 whatever car, he never knows what she is. Even at the end when he's figured out that she was the one who killed his father because of the cat, which like she could have just found the cat, dude. You literally stole the cat from somebody else. Nobody knows how this works. It felt very much unanswered because he never actually learns that she is a vampire, unlike the Addie, and she obviously sees the girl commit an act of vampiracy on Hussein and then rejects her and says you need to leave. And I think that that's a really important signifier as well of sort of the way that their relationship breaks down, is that when she is with Arash, she is human, because only when she is with Arash do we see her take off the veil of the vampiric qualities that she has, and literally taking off the veil so that she can put on her Jean-Paul Gaultier like striped sweater.
That in itself is the struggle that you see in vampiric characters. It's kind of this balance between their human selves and their more monstrous vampiric selves. And they have to feed and they have to like keep up this vampiric activity in order to survive. And there is that almost like primal side to them that is the need to feed. But then there's also those human things where you see them kind of deal with emotions.
Yeah, there's a great case to be made with how they interact with their own humanity, and I think that that's part of the reason like why there's such a stark juxtaposition between soundtracks as well, because you look at the largely electronic and sort of ambient score that is taking place, a more traditional film music style. So I'm thinking about particularly when she and Hussein are walking in parallel. It's sort of that Ennio Morricone, big, brassy, almost Western-inspired duel score that's going on, and it's supposed to be setting it up like a duel with, the brassy trumpets. Juxtaposing that too with the way that there's that purring that gets turned into a whole electronic score when we learn that the cat is her familiar that she can see through. It's very traditional in its film score style, even though it is, I think, still really unique and beautifully blended, but it is the opposite of every time that we see her in her home when she doesn't have the shawl on, when she looks like a regular person and she's just reading or lounging or listening to music. It goes to the rock music, and it'll switch to like rock or jazz or sort of that Iranian folk style. And so I think that that too is supposed to represent the juxtaposition between the human, which is playful and fun and quirky and a little bit weird, with the vampire, which is very stark, traditional, cut and dry.
That kind of goes along with like the whole idea that vampires are these old entities. In whatever media, you always see them in this, they're hundreds, maybe even thousands of years old.
And we don't know how old this girl is.
We don't even know her name.
We never get to find out. We don't even know her name. It's kind of cool. She is the girl with no name, which I think that that's sort of indicative of the Sergio Leone movies too, because the character in the movie is supposed to be the man with no name. So there is sort of that clear reference as well. We don't ever get to learn who she is, what she is.
I think it's also a reference to the whole masculinity and like sexual abuse kind of themes as well, because given the role reversal, if she is a girl, then in reality, it's a boy or a man. So it's kind of like a nod to it could be any man. And it's multiplying the fear of modern women.
Or it could be any girl. Any girl that is walking home is sort of subject to this treatment. Because ultimately, she's not treated the best by Saheed.
Right.
She's not treated safely. She is obviously reclaiming her power in the space on those streets with all those Dutch angles. A Dutch angle, for those of you listening, is when the camera perspective is slightly askew or dramatically askew of the horizon line.
There's a certain effect that goes along with that, and that is of old television. Like, think TV Land, like 50s and 60s.
Cathode ray televisions.
I mean, it's not black and white, but think like the Brady Bunch. And I know that was later, but like think of like the background images. You see like the houses in the distance. They look like they're fake, but you know that they're not. It has that like weird quality to it.
Like familiar, but also surreal.
Yeah. And it looks like that's not a real thing that's over there, but you know it is.
Mm-hmm. Because it has to be.
It looks vintage, the way that they shot this, because of the Dutch angles, but also, the black and white. Some other stuff that's interesting about the cinematography of this film is, well, one, the script, and we'll get to that in a second, but the pacing of it and the way that the scenes play out, it almost feels like you're getting the story through montage. I think that the script also has to do with that, because the script is very minimalist. Mm-hmm. Almost nothing is said that doesn't need to be said for you to understand what's going on. That also plays into the montage delivery. You don't stay anywhere for too long, at least mentally.
There are a lot of juxtapositions between really short, just atmospheric clips and then really long drawn out shots where you get to just sort of watch the characters move and interact. And I think that that's really marvelously done. And there is something almost surreal to it, especially when they're on the streets. There is a surprising number of descending streets. And it's sort of interesting because I can't think of a single time in the film where we saw any character ascend. We only see them fall.
Interesting.
And so, I think that that sort of represents the idea of continually getting dragged down. And Bad City is this sort of inescapable place. And Arash, even when he tries to ascend, and that's the metaphorical ascension of his class, but he ends up in that ascension falling back, and she takes him to her house. And so we get to sort of watch him be pulled down into her world, which is sort of at the lowest level. And it's not until they literally leave Bad City that they get to escape that sort of planing. And I think that's probably part of a power dynamic as well.
And to go along with the theme of power and ranking of it, I feel like there's a good reason to put a pimp and a sex worker in the film. There's a clear hierarchy in that relationship as well.
And there's a really important sort of distinction to be made about how the men are viewing the women in the film, because that same worker, we see how she interacts with another woman, which is not the best interaction, but there is an inherent like sort of bond of safety between them. Even when the girl kills Hussein, Addie is like, all right, well, let's drag him out to the corner. Like, let's get him out of here. And she's like, I can't obviously be around you anymore. But she's not going to rat her out. She's not going to say what she did. And likewise, the girl watches her key Arash's car, because she thinks that it's Sahid's. But after keying the car, they don't really say anything. They end up actually both going back to Adi's apartment. And Adi has a lot of sort of traditionally feminine elements to her, the way that she puts on makeup and the way that she looks, whereas I think that the girl for the most part is a little ambiguously gendered. But then Addie also, in the way that she gets treated as a substitute for Hussein's wife who had died. When they have the whole scene where he forces her to do heroin, and then he just wants to like lay by her side and be like, oh, you're my wife now. I'm reliving the days when I had a wife, and really any woman will do. And that's sort of the whole aesthetic view of women from the terrible men in this movie. Any woman is a stand-in for any woman. And I think that that's why it's also so important that the girl intimidates the boy in the alley when she steals his skateboard, and she brings out the fangs, and then they throw in the really slow voice modulation, and she terrifies him into being afraid of women. And that's, I think, supposed to be representative of the fact that fear and respect are often misinterpreted. So she's trying to impart that onto this young boy.
Yeah, I kind of read that almost like the reversal of an abusive relationship. I guess, still an abusive relationship, because he saw the girl dragging Hussein's body out of Eddie's house. So like he knows that she had something to do with it. And then when Arash is asking the boy, do you know who did this? Do you know anything? And he's going, no. And Arash can tell he knows, and he's trying to get out of him, but the boy is too afraid of the girl to actually tell. And that's kind of like the sign of an abusive relationship, is when, someone has caused you trauma, but you're too afraid of them to actually do anything about it or even tell anyone about it.
Right, and I really wasn't expecting that messaging to happen in this film. And I remember when we were watching it, I even said to you, oh, it's going to be like her brother or something, and we're going to get tricked. And then it is absolutely not that. It is one of the more mortifying parts of the movie, because you're like, is she really about to kill this kid? And then she just steals his skateboard, and we get the cool like shot of her skateboarding down the middle of the road with the cape out.
Not something you get to see in classic vampire movies.
Not at all. Speaking of classic vampire movies, Zach, I think it's time for our first game. I have prepared for you. This one is really short. It's really easy. Hopefully. It's not going to be easy. I don't know why I said that. There's
Oh,
only
great.
3 questions, but this game is called Fake Fangs, as in, fake fans, in which I'm going to give you 3 names, as well as the movie that the name is from, and I want you to identify which character is not the vampire. Sound good?
Sure.
And everyone who is listening, you may feel free to play along. Let us know in our email if you got them all right, or leave a comment on the YouTube video. So, number 1, Jerry Dandridge from Fright Night, Michael Emerson from The Lost Boys, or Henry Sturgis from Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. So which one of those is not a vampire?
Okay. Can you say just the names one more time?
Yep. Jerry Dandridge, Michael Emerson, Henry Sturgis.
I'm pretty sure Henry Sturgis is a vampire. I'm going to go with the second one, whatever, Emerson.
Michael Emerson, that is correct. So in the movie The Lost Boys, Michael Emerson is bitten and almost becomes a vampire, but because he does not ever partake in the killing and drinking of human blood, he does not become a vampire, and once the lead vampire is killed, he is returned to normal as a human. Congratulations, you have got the first one correct.
Wow.
All right.
Was a complete guess.
These only increase in difficulty, so here's the second one.
Great.
It's much harder. Number 1, Kurt Barlow from Salem's Lot, Eben Olsen from 30 Days of Night, Sean Crenshaw from the Monster Squad.
Sean Crenshaw.
That is correct. Sean Crenshaw is not a vampire. In fact, Dracula is the vampire in the Monster Squad, and he uses the name Alucard.
Yeah, see, that one I kind of knew because I knew Monster Squad was like pretty classic in its handling of monsters.
Yeah, they've got Wolfman and Frankie and the Fish Dude, which is cool. Yeah.
Fish dude.
Yeah.
Like the Black Lagoon.
The creature from the Black Lagoon guy, yeah. Are you ready for this one, Zach?
All right, yeah. Let's go.
These are vampires from the hit anime series Monogatari. The name of the first one, Tropicalesque Homawave Dog Strings.
Shit.
Vampire 2, Deathtopia Virtuoso Suicide Master.
Okay, not
Vampire
that one.
3, Kiss Shot Pisces of the Infinite Blade.
Oh, it's got to be the first one. Even remember what it was, but it did not sound like a vampire name.
Tropicalesque Homawave Dog Strings.
That one.
Zach, I'm afraid that is a vampire in the Monogatari series. It is, in fact, the third, Kiss Shot Pisces of the Infinite Blade. Their real name in the show is Kiss Shot Acerola Orion Heart Under the Blade.
Well,
Other important vampires of this series include Dramaturgy, High Waist, Low Rise. So for a brief period, they were influenced by types of
Pants?
jeans. And Koyoma Aragari.
okay. Why do all these characters have like 20 names? They're like
Exactly.
Spanish kings.
So good try.
I mean, 2
You
out
did-
of 3 when I was expecting it 0, so.
So yeah, this is a particularly good vampire movie, and I think that it would be good to talk about the essence of the vampirism. First of all, obviously we've mentioned, it's the girl. She is the eponymous vampire in A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. How does she hold up, do you think, in the canon of vampires?
Like I said earlier, they kind of throw some of those classic vampire moves at you, but then they don't attempt to insert any of like the weaknesses that we associate with vampires being, garlic,
Crosses,
the sun, the big ones.
a stake to the heart.
Well, that'd kill anyone.
Right. I mean, I guess that's true. You can't necessarily say that that's a vampire specific. Whereas some would say that the sun could also kill anyone.
That's true. Given enough time.
If you leave them outside enough, they could develop some sort of melanoma or like a really bad sunburn.
Throw them on some asphalt and they'll just fry.
And they'll just they'll just cook.
Where are we going with this? Oh, she doesn't. They don't attempt to make her seem like she has any of those classic weaknesses.
Yeah, she literally has nothing to fear in this movie.
The vampirism is just like a vehicle to make her the predator of the movie, and like that
Makes her strong.
right in the hierarchy of the characters in the film, puts her at the top automatically, because no one else seems to have this kind of supernatural ability that makes them this kind of stealthy murderer.
You know what's interesting? Oh man, you just saying that, it just made me realize they bookended the food chain. They put women at the top and bottom of the food chain.
Ah,
Because it goes the girl, Sahid, Arash, Hussein, Adi. So they show her as both the top and the bottom.
that works really well with the whole mirroring idea of the movie too. But to answer your original question, I feel like it's like a 20% match to that classic Dracula image that we know.
I like that they don't give her very many lines, and even when Arash is talking to her, she doesn't really respond all that much. Mm-hmm. It's almost a learning thing and like a blank expression, like she was assimilating. There's this sensation that when she's watching these men, she's like learning about them as she's doing it, even though we sort of are treated to this idea that she already knows everything. And I think about how she interacts with Sahid. She like watches him do drugs and lift weights, and she like learns the behavior. And then it's not until he starts interacting with her in that masculine power dynamic that she even makes the move. That's too one of the things I think about the idea of consent within this film is Sahid makes a move on her and then she retaliates, and Hussein crosses the street first. And he or whatever that guy is, he like, not Hussein, crosses the street and then he gets attacked, and then Hussein is the aggressor towards Ati.
It was Hussein early in the movie, but she didn't kill him then. She killed him later.
She didn't kill him then. Why didn't she kill him then?
I mean, I think it's suspense. Some horror elements. They had to put some kind of
The only one that isn't really explainable is the homeless man.
I think he was merely a device to show she needs to feed.
And it's almost sad in like the way that she has to go about it, because you know the others she sort of like devilishly pounces on, but she approaches him a lot slower. It almost feels like it's a tense struggle for her, because her preferred target is the men with no scruples.
Yeah, the homeless man is like super afraid of her to start. He's like, what do you want from me? Just, can you like not be up in my business? And
What are you doing?
right.
Yeah.
And I feel like that made her like hesitate a little bit in the way that some predatory men out there might second guess their actions when a girl reacts that way.
Yeah.
Might.
I like the idea that they really do put her at the top of the metaphorical and literal food chain. And I think it's interesting that this is really honestly the first vampire movie I can think of in a long time that doesn't have some sort of factor that can kill the vampire. That is never explored. And I mean, you think about Dracula and he dies, always like a way that somebody's trying to kill the vampire. Somebody knows that there's a vampire, and that there's always like a Van Helsing character to take care of it. There's always a monster hunter. And this is the first time that there's very clearly not a monster hunter. There's nobody that's going to take care of this issue. And as an audience member, you almost don't want people to take care of her because she's a vigilante.
But Matt, she's the monster hunter.
She's the monster hunter. God damn
And
it.
the
I
monster.
didn't get it until I repeated it, and then I realized yeah, you are correct.
Well, I think that's the intention, is that you're expecting someone to come after her the whole time, and when she's really the one that's serving the justice.
That's the sort of weird thing. It's the conflict in this movie isn't necessarily what we would expect of a traditional horror movie. Instead, it is those moments of suspense, and there's a sort of romance undertone to it, which I know is not unheard of in vampire movies, but
Definitely not.
I feel like very rarely the romantic undertones do not also include the vampire, except for Twilight, which I don't count as a real piece of fiction.
Well, it may be a vampire movie, but it's not a horror movie.
It's so much more than that.
I mean, I've never seen it, so maybe
And also
maybe there is.
less.
Anyways, so while we're on that subject, I feel like a lot of the suspense and horror, I guess, comes from her interactions with Arash. It's like, when's he gonna mess up and give her a reason to feed on him?
Yeah, when's he gonna make a move?
And he doesn't, of course. The question that I had at the end of the movie is why is Arash different? And I think that you've answered that question with this idea of consent. And then there's like this weird, when they first meet each other, going back to that scene.
He's staring at the lamp, high out of his mind.
They're talking, he's like trying to figure out how to get home and explains his costume. He's like, oh, look, I'm Dracula. And he's joking about it. But the way that she looks at him after that, it's almost as if she believes that he's Dracula. She starts looking at him with this awe and almost reverence in her eyes.
I mean, a case could be made that Arash is a sort of vampire in a way.
In what way?
I was hoping you'd explain that.
I don't see that.
Okay, so here's the thing. Every other character in this movie is a vampire except kind of Arash, because I would say that Sahid he's a vicious person, he is a bloodsucker, and he's draining Arash and he's draining Ati, and that's supposed to be part of it. And then Hussein is draining Arash and draining Ati. They're sort of consuming them because everything that they are doing is destroying who Arash and Ati are as people, as individuals, as human. And so it's sort of sapping away at their humanity, and we get to watch these two characters become other rather than human. I think that there is sort of a idea that Arash wants to become that. He's sort of a leech, and especially in regard to how he deals with his employer and his employer's daughter who he sees at the party. Like, he's trying to work his way up the food chain, literally, but ultimately he's not going to be able to do that. So I wonder if there's sort of a mutual experience between the two.
What's also interesting, it's funny that you mentioned both Hassin and Sahid being vampiric in their own ways. They are almost always wearing dark colors. We don't know.
All black.
Well, we don't know if it might be a different color because it's in black and white.
I would bet that it's black because it's all like it's like biker leather.
Right. And then also Hassin has that like kind of black sweater that he's wearing a lot of the time. And Arash is, at least originally, wearing a very white shirt, and he's wearing white and lighter colors throughout the film.
Looking like a Iranian John Travolta.
Yeah, and that may have been not necessarily to be like black is tainted and white is pure, not necessarily that idea, but with the lens of black and white palette choice in this film, just to contrast him to the other men in the film.
And there's always that old saying about things not being black and white. And I think that you're totally correct. And that makes the girl's clothing even more impactful, considering she's wearing a black and white striped shirt or sweater that she has on for the whole movie, because then it's supposed to be like, oh, she is somewhere in between. She is the anti-hero. You know, on one side she is performing a service to the community, which is eliminating bad people, but at the same time she is still a slave to her vampiric urges, and it's still sort of monstrous and something to be afraid of. And so we get a nice, like, a taut dichotomy between those two things.
Yeah. In other news, since we brought up Sahid, his tattoo.
It says sex on his neck.
Sex. Like, yeah, like right on his, like by his clavicles.
And then he has Pac-Man on the back of his neck.
Yeah, I don't know what that, I mean, he's got tattoos all over. Is there a certain meaning to that, or?
To the Pac-Man one? Absolutely.
Like what?
He is gluttonous and all-consuming.
Okay, that makes sense.
That is the one that I came up with. It probably also is a means of trying to, like, force you as the audience to not be able to carbon date this movie.
Also that he eats ghosts.
That is true. We do see him eat a whole line of ghosts.
That's what cocaine is. That's what makes it so powerful, is the souls of the dead.
You know, that's how they used to, if you had ghosts in your blood, you took a line of coke and you were fine. That's what they used to do in the 1890s.
Like bleeding with leeches.
Yeah, exactly.
Then the leeches are high.
You got ghosts in your blood, kid.
Bring out the cocaine.
Bring out the cocaine and leeches.
And the leeches.
Exactly.
Where was I going with this? Oh, he has the sex tattoo. And then you see later on there is some graffiti like in the background. It says sex it's almost like subliminal messaging.
Oh, yeah.
Sex is always present. You know, there's that whole idea that men can't go, what is it, like 8 seconds or something that's terribly exaggerated.
inaccurate.
Yeah,
Without
like you
thinking.
can't go.
I was thinking it might be a matter of emphasizing the difference between the sexes, literally taking on the imagery of male versus female.
Well, you mentioned before we got a little derailed the difficulty with placing this film in history. Is there are so many like pop culture references, and in the very beginning, you kind of get this feel as like, okay, like 50s. He's got like this 50s kind of car. He's dressed like a greaser, like you said earlier, and the music is kind of like on the older side.
Yeah, the music is like Parisian folk accordion music with a double bass player playing the bass line.
Which was super cool.
Yeah, oh, it was awesome. It totally came out of left field and it was completely opposite of what you see on the screen. And then Lionel Richie's Hello.
And then there's that White Lies song,
Death, yeah.
and that's from 2009. There's all these different things. I can't think of, there's something else that...
Well, the Pac-Man is 90s. But yeah, one of the things that makes it impossible to date this movie, and actually, do you know what one of the key ways that people date film is? It's the phones. You can almost always tell what year a movie was made based on what the phones look like. Even sci-fi movies, you can tell when the movie was made based on how they treated the technology that allowed them to have phones.
There are no phones in this movie.
Right.
There's no cell phones. You don't see any phones at all. And another thing, sorry, I just remembered, the Ronald Reagan mask at the party.
The Ronald Reagan mask.
And you're like, what year is it? Like, it had to have been after, at least after or during the 80s for that to be a thing.
Yeah, where are you going to find a Ronald Reagan mask these days?
Well, even
Party
before,
City?
like, there's no way there are Ronald Reagan masks before 80s. Regardless, I mean, there's a song from 2009 in the movie that they put a record on. It implies that this song is being played on the record.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the timelessness of toxic masculinity and the fear that a lot of women have walking home
It's an
alone at
infinite
night.
concept.
Right.
Yeah.
It is timeless and transcendent. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what time you live in. Doesn't matter where you live.
One of the most striking shots is whenever it shows that like little ravine and the ravine is full of bodies on the outskirts of the oil rigs.
Yeah.
That never gets explained and it's never talked about and it's never given meaning in the film. It's not ever really even used as like a plot point in the film except for one time when we see a person throwing a body into it. So what do you think it represents?
The nameless void that is women that get sexually abused and taken advantage of.
Is that really what you think?
That's my off-the-cuff guess.
I think that that's a totally fair assessment. There is something weirdly like nameless and numerous about it, and I think that that is one of the marks of this movie that's really interesting, is that it is so surreal at times, and then other times it is very realistic. But whenever it shows that shot, it's always just like, whoa, what is happening here? I don't think that it has anything to do with like who the girl's victims are. I think it's sort of a product of Bad City. I think that it's another part of the class distinction. And to go even further, think about how that sort of assault works. There is a disproportionate number of people affected if it is from a lower social class. So I think that part of it is them being lost to the system. So I do agree with your take that it has something to do with sort of the namelessness of these victims and sort of ideology of victimhood in general, which is when you become a victim, you lose your identity. You are a Jane Doe or a John Doe.
Yeah, that makes sense. Something that just occurred to me when you were saying that, because it's by the oil, the field where they're drilling for oil. Dead bodies under the pressure of the earth that decompose, they become oil. Then they're drilling for a while. So I wonder if that has anything to do with...
People get used up and recycled.
Yeah. So I think that goes along with what you're saying really well.
It becomes this cycle of using and destroying people.
I think it's really just supposed to be like this cyclical idea.
The cyclic destruction of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, basically. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of things in this movie that can mean a lot of things, and I think that you can draw your own conclusions by watching them, but these are just our thoughts. Speaking of our thoughts, most of the events of the movie take place at night. And in fact, aside from when Hussein's body is discovered, I'm not sure there are any other scenes where any of the characters are out in daylight.
And when he's stealing the cat at the beginning.
Right, there's that. But I feel like there's got to be a reference to vampirism.
I mean, also he's stealing a cat. I think that's pretty obvious about taking from women. Think about euphemisms.
Think Tom Jones. Anyways.
We have another game. So this one is just called Bosom Blood-Sucking Buddies.
Sorry, wait. Is that like the Better Business Bureau?
Yeah.
It's the BBB.
I'm going to name for you 2 vampires, and I want you to tell me what they are from, and this can be film or television. All right. Number 1, Lestat and Louis.
They're from the same thing.
They're from the same thing. I will tell you, one of them is played by Tom Cruise, and one of them is played by Brad Pitt.
Oh, Interview with a Vampire.
Correct. That is correct.
That was actually what I was thinking originally.
A grand old vampire movie. All right, this one will be a little trickier, but this one is a television series, I will tell you. Bill Compton and Eric Northman. I'll give you a little bit about it. It is an HBO original television series.
That doesn't know me.
All right. That one is True Blood.
I'll be honest, and I feel pretty stupid right now. I didn't know True Blood was about vampires.
Well, that would...
I thought it was like a dynasty kind of thing, you know? Bloodlines.
Yeah, True Blood it has vampires in it, but it also has werewolves, werepanthers, fairies. All right, are you ready for your next one?
Yeah.
This one, I think that you're going to get it. I think you'll know this. This is a television series. The 2 vampires are Lily and Grandpa.
The Munsters?
It is the Munsters!
Does Grandpa really not have a name?
His name's Grandpa Munster. All right, this one is another movie. It is Barnabas Collins and Victoria Winters.
That's a hard game for someone who hasn't seen many vampire movies.
Helena Bonham Carter is also in this movie, and it was directed by Tim Burton.
I feel like the more information you give me, the more confused I get. Nope, I don't know.
It's Dark Shadows.
I've never even heard of that one.
Oh yeah, it's it's like it's a period piece, so it's set in like the 70s. This one will be a little bit easier. Edward and Bella.
Well, that's I almost said True Blood. The other one that's not good. Twilight.
I'm afraid it's not actually Twilight, Zach. It's Breaking Dawn. Bella doesn't become a vampire until the 4th movie.
Is that the same? I thought it was. Wait, so what's Breaking Dawn? Is
It's
that like
the
a
same
sequel?
series.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the 4th movie. Twilight's the 1st movie, and she's not a vampire in that movie.
Well, that's fine. I at least got close. I'm counting that as a small victory.
Congratulations. I have about 15 more. We're going to stop
Really?
them, though. There are a lot of movies with 2 vampires.
Well, yeah, that's kind of vampire thing is that they turn people, and that's what gives you hope about them, is that they might have some humanity and attachment too.
That's it for my games. That's what I had. Some trivia related vampire games. Thank you everyone for joining us for this week's episode of Watch No Evil. This is Matt.
And this is Zach.
And we'll see you the same time next week.